Hello everyone, welcome to another great video here, and in this video I'll be talking about the RAM, which is the random access memory. And in this video I have the DDR4. Now before we actually talk about the DDR4, let's go back in history a bit. Now before we came to the DDR4, or actually the DDR5, which is actually the latest on the market, we had the DDR1, the DDR2, the DDR3 and the DDR4. And from all this, they had their own differences. So when you look at the DDR, let me say 2, the DDR2 had a lower data transfer compared to the DDR3, but with a very high voltage requirement, which is actually 1.8 volts. And when you look at the DDR3 actually has a very lower data transfer compared to the DDR4, but with a very high voltage requirement of about 1.35 volts to about 1.5 volts. And the DDR actually 4 has a very high data transfer, but with a very lower voltage requirement, which is about 1.2 volts. And basically there's also another type of new RAM which has actually come in, which is actually the DDR5, which suits into the different types of motherboards, and currently it's not very easy to actually access. Why does even the RAM actually matter in the computer? Or why can't you just pick up a DDR2 or 3, and since you have the best CPU, the best motherboard, and you have the highest storage system, why should you pick up a DDR4 or maybe a DDR5 of RAM? All right, so now the first reason is that you have to actually look at the type of motherboard that you're actually running. In that, specific motherboards actually are designed to run specific type of RAM. Someone would ask, so can I take a DDR3 RAM and put it on a DDR4 motherboard? Theoretically, with brackets, yes, but practically, no, you can't. The first reason is that the computer itself, or the motherboard itself, even the CPU, are designed to actually pick up the system on a DDR4. If the PC, actually the motherboard is designed for the DDR4, then even the computer system itself will be designed to pick up instruction based on the DDR4. The next one is that when you look at let me say from my DDR4 here, you find that the design of the DDR4 itself, when you look at this slot here, the position of each slot actually on the DDR2, DDR3 and the DDR4, even the DDR5 itself actually is the position is actually different. You find that the DDR4 is a bit lower, and the DDR3 is actually a bit lower, and the DDR4 is actually a bit higher. So you find that it's not able to fit into the slot of the DDR4. The other question someone will ask, how about Michael, can I take the DDR4 and put it into the DDR3 motherboard? Basically and theoretically yes, but practically you cannot do that. All right, so now why is the RAM really important in the computer? I think someone would want to know this type of question. So I'm gonna divide it like this. So the RAM is like a mediator between the CPU and the storage system in your computer. So the simplest example I can give is the operating system. Let's say you run Windows 10 on your computer. The Windows 10 on your computer is actually stored on one of the hard drive, or maybe an SSD, or maybe HDD, or even the M2 SSDs. So you find that when you turn on your computer, the operating system loads in. So the CPU will require a command of that operating system for it to load, and this operating system actually loads from the storage system and into the RAM. and then from the RAM there, and then into the CPU, where the CPU actually does all the commands system. Now, when you find that, if number one, let me say you are using a DDR3 which has got a very lower data transfer, because your operating system has to be transferred from the storage system that, or maybe the hard drive that you're using, to the RAM, and from the RAM into the CPU for the CPU to carry out different calculations and commands. So you find that if your data transfer actually, your let me say your DDR3 is actually, which has a lower data transfer, or maybe if you have a very small RAM, you find that it's not able to actually transfer all the data that is required for the CPU to run. So hence, some data is sent back into the storage system, or maybe an HDD, or maybe SSD, or whatever you're running. So you find that that process of transferring and transferring back actually slows down the rate at which work is executed into the computer. So that's why it's very advisable that you run a very high amount of RAM, and mostly a recommended type of RAM is about 8 GB. And if you can have about 16 GB, it's actually better, because you find that most of the files, such as games, actually require a lot of space for them to actually be sent into the RAM and then executed into the CPU. So you find that that thing of transferring and transferring back, you find that it slows down the rate at which your files, or maybe your games, can actually run. And the other thing is that, the other thing that you should take into consideration is that, when you are using, let me say, I give you an example of the DDR2 or DDR3, you find that they have a very high voltage requirement. So you find that let me say, you have a very high voltage requirement and with a very low RAM. So you find that the transferring and execution of work, you find that your computer is able to use a lot of electricity. So the best way to save for a long-term purpose of saving money, it's better you just invest into buying a very high RAM and a very good modern RAM, such as the DDR4. And if you can actually manage, it's better you just buy the DDR5, especially if you run things like games and high-end design softwares. So the last thing that I would like to talk about, someone would actually ask me, what type of brand of DDR RAM should I actually buy? So the best brands, so there are different types of brands you can buy. If you want to go with a cheaper version, you can actually buy Kingbank, and but if you want to buy the best tested version of myself, I would recommend you buy things like Kingston. Kingston is actually the best that I've actually used without any problems so far. So when it also comes to DDR4s, we've got different types of DDR4s. We have the 2066 megahertz, we have the 3600, and all these types of we also have the 3200. So all these types of consideration should be taken into consideration, because the higher the one that you choose, the better and higher at which data is actually transferred. And also this also takes into consideration of actually the price tag. And in my case, I'm actually using the DDR4 16 GB and 3600 megahertz.